Fáilte a cóide go club leabhar Eilís Dillon mar cuid de léamhmór na Gaillimhe. You're very welcome to our first session of the Eilís Dillon Bookclub as part of Galway's Great Read in this Eilís Dillon's special centenary year. Over the next 4 weeks we'll be exploring the life and work of Galway's own writer Eilís Dillon through the lens of her first historical novel, published in 1958. And I believe it's a great time to shine a spotlight on The Bitter Glass, a book that has perhaps been neglected and that can bring pleasure to many readers, not only in Galway but across the globe. And it will certainly resonate with people interested in Irish history and culture, the oral tradition, the Irish landscape, and of course Connemara. And at Galway Public Libraries we're adapting to these unprecedented times by running this book club online. And I'm delighted that we have 25 members here present this evening, or about to join us. So it's going to be an exciting experiment and an enjoyable one, no doubt. And sometimes book clubs focus on one book per week, and but we're actually going to slow down the process because reading is one of life's great pleasures. And we're going to use The Bitter Glass as a springboard to explore and celebrate Eilís Dillon's life and legacy. And each week we'll have a different theme and a guest speaker. So we're going to ease our way into the book, because I know a lot of people are still ordering it, and whether it's from the last copy on Amazon or Kenny's copy, or so a lot of people have just read the first 3 chapters on the eilishDillon.net website, and that's fine because we're going to take it nice and gently this evening, and we're going to talk about, I suppose, the world that Eilís Dillon is building in those first few chapters, the landscape, and we're also I'm delighted and honoured that we have her daughter and son here this evening as our first guests. So we'll be joined later on by Emily Cullen, distinguished poet, and Cormac O'Cullen, her son, also a distinguished writer. So I just want to tell you now, to give you an overview of what we'll be covering in the next few weeks. So I'm just going to try and share something, if you'll bear with me here. Can you all see that there? So tonight we're looking at the world of the novel in those first few chapters, and talking about, I suppose, the woman herself and her life, and I suppose especially her early life in Galway we'll be talking about. In week 2 we're going to delve a bit more deeply into the history and the folklore and the oral tradition in The Bitter Glass, and we'll have an expert on Eilís Dillon next week, Anne-Marie Heron, who did her entire PhD on the author, so that's exciting. And in week 3 then we'll expand the conversation a little bit more to look at her fiction for children. She's of course very much in the pantheon of children's writers. Indeed, when she started writing, she'd written 30 books for children. And when she started writing for children, those first few books in Irish as well, there was very little literature in Ireland for children. So she has really blazed a trail in that sphere as well. And we'll be joined by Siobhan Morrissey, who is doing her PhD on Eilís Dillon's fiction for children. And there will be a little focus on the seals as well. So if you'd like to get a copy of the seals and to start reading that, if you really want to get intrepid, you can get that on Kindle. And it's a lovely book. It's also a historic fiction, and it's a kind of similar theme in terms of the history and the years covered to The Bitter Glass. And then in our final week then, we'll look more broadly at The Bitter Glass, in its time and its context in a comparative way. And we'll be talking to Maureen O'Connor, who will discuss the landscape, the literature landscape in Ireland in the 1950s and 60s, and place it in its comparative context. So that's a little overview. Now, before we get into the discussion, I just have a few housekeeping guidelines. We're aiming for a relaxed, informal event where everyone gets a chance to talk. This isn't a specialist group for experts. We're all, I suppose many of us are learning about Eilís Dillon together. And of course, everyone's opinion counts. There are no right and wrong answers in a book club. And we all have our own unique way of experiencing a book. So I find personally it's a good idea to read with a pencil in hand sometimes and to underline the passages that strike you as enjoyable, and maybe to share your excitement then. We can talk about our enthusiasm then each week. In terms of the practicalities, I'd also ask you to please switch on your video so that we can keep the human touch in this cyber delivery, but you might please mute the mics for much of, until we get to the discussion in the breakout rooms shortly, because we can get a lot of background sound, and we are such a large group. So as I said, we're going to ease our way into the book by focusing on the world that Dillon is creating in this novel. And before I tell you a little bit about her life and biographical information, I would love to hear your own introductions, just to get your names, to hear where you're joining us from, and if you could tell us about anything about the writer, if you had heard of her before, perhaps you hadn't, or perhaps you grew up like I did with one or two of her books on the shelves at home. We always had Across the Bitter Sea on the shelf, or indeed if you've read any of her books before. So. Hi everyone, I look forward to meeting you all. Would anyone like to start the ball rolling?
Okay, my name is Aoife. Hi, I work in the library. I work in the school's library services. So at the moment I'm quite involved in the whole Eilís Dillon experience as well. So yeah, I would have heard of Eilís Dillon. I would have had books on the shelves. I can't remember which ones I read when I was a child, but I'm delighted now to be reading this one, one of her adult books. So yeah, I've read the first 2 chapters and I absolutely love it. I think it's wonderful, and the writing is just fantastic.
Very crisp, isn't it? Yeah.
The imagery. Yeah, the imagery is just just wonderful. So
thanks,
that's
Ita.
me.
That's lovely. Who else have we got there?
Kay, would you like to say hello?
Hello, my name is Kay McCormack, and I was, I suppose I'm McCormack the McCormacks married Germaine Plunkett and Bill McCormack, and so I'm married to a McCormack. So my father-in-law would be a step cousin of Geraldine Plunkett. So so I'm interested in Eilís's work, because he actually said he was very proud of Eilís's writing, and he showed me the book and he had it on the shelf. So I'm delighted to be able to meet and see Cormac and Aileen, and because you're third cousins of my children. So so maybe we'll meet sometime, but I'm looking forward to reading and discussing everything.
That's lovely, Kay, and it's exciting to hear about your family connection and the family pride as well. That's lovely. Bridget, would you like to say hello there?
Oh, my name is Box, and I'm a Galwegian living in North Cork for a very long time. So this online opportunity is great, because otherwise, if we were doing it the normal way, I couldn't be at the book club. But Eilís Dillon was always a presence that I was aware of. I remember being a member of the Children's Library in Galway when it was in the courthouse, but I don't remember seeing her books there, to be quite honest. And I was one of those children who kind of read my way out of the Children's Library, and Mr. Sharkey used to allow me to take books that he'd approved of from the adult library. When Mr. Sharkey was the county librarian, he was in the building and all of that. So I'm pretty sure I met her maybe in the 70s, so somewhere way back. One of these launchy things, or else she was giving a lecture or something of that kind. So there was always that kind of a presence. So
You were familiar with her then? Yes.
I was, and I have
great.
the book. I suppose I don't know if it's hard to know at what stage, because when I was younger, you couldn't.
Well, that's grand. It's just to get a sense of if people are familiar with her and if they've heard of her. And thanks very much, Bridget. Susan, would you like to introduce yourself there?
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Susan Kelly. I'm from Westport, and delighted to take part and to really be introduced to Eilís Dillon's work, which I must admit I wasn't familiar with the work, very familiar with her name, obviously, and I've read the first 3 chapters and loved it, and I'm waiting for my copy to arrive in the post to continue. So.
That's great. Like many people are still waiting and but getting very, very drawn in with the first 3 chapters. Who else over there? Roisin, would you like to say hello?
This gentleman here, is that Kevin? Or Joe?
Joe, yeah.
Joe,
Joe
how
McGuire.
are you,
I knew the name, but very little else. And one of my neighbours told me about this book club. So I've read the first 3 chapters, and that's all I know really in terms of the reading. So I'm just hoping to learn a lot more.
Great. I think many of us were all kind of at a similar stage, really. We're just exploring together. Teresa, would you like to say hello?
Hello.
How are you?
Yeah, Teresa is my name. I feel I read some of her stuff way back, maybe when I was a child, but I haven't even read the 3 chapters you're talking about. Did I miss something that I should have read 3 chapters? I can't remember.
No, there's no homework for anyone. But just, I suppose, if we could kind of commit to reading the novel over the next few weeks, it would be great. It's only 220 pages, and I'm a slow reader myself because I love to underline things, and I read it in 2 sittings. So I think if that's encouraging for people, I think you'd read it fairly quickly. It is quite gripping, and it's a lovely, simple story as well. So yeah, keep it up, read on. Who else have we got there? Eileen. Hi.
Hi. My name is Eileen. I'm from Dunleary, and I don't know Eilís Dillon very well, but funny thing is, I can remember stopping on the way back from Galway one time, and her family were in the hotel. It was the day of her funeral, and I have read the 3 chapters and I really love them. And the interesting thing I think is that I've just finished Troubles by J.G. Farrell, and I think one of maybe the benefits of the pandemic is that we're in a very significant anniversary year, and a lot of the narrative looked like it was going to be very contentious, and I think it all seems to have disappeared. Everyone seems to have forgotten that was something we should be doing this year. And having read J.G. Farrell's book and now starting this, I think it's really nice that there they are, the books, the writers. There is something that can help us to appreciate the times. And just starting that book and just having finished the other one, I got a great kick out of that.
Thank you very much for that point. That's a wonderful point. And I think, the epigraph "Gaze no more in the bitter glass." It has been difficult for us, I suppose, as Irish people. We've been reluctant, perhaps, to talk about the Civil War, and so this is a lovely kind of vehicle for having those conversations as well. Yeah. And who else have we? Oh, Martina, how are you?
Hi, Emily. How's it going?
Lovely to see you. How are you keeping?
Nice to be here. I didn't realize I was going to be speaking. I might have put on lipstick. So I'm very familiar with the name Eilís Dillon. Unfortunately, not so familiar with actual work, even though I have bought over a couple of years copies of her children's books I've seen in charity shops.
Very good.
I bought them. I haven't read them, which is the habit of buying books, and but I did buy the lovely reprint issue, Sound of Horses, for my friend's child recently. So I was particularly to tie in actually with this Galway 2020 event and celebrating her.
Very good. Oh, that's
And so yesterday, it was very interesting. I sat down to read the opening 3 chapters. Absolutely loved it. And what I really struck was on the website was the lovely mention of Eudora Wheatley. And I just actually was reading one of her stories yesterday too. So there's lovely connection.
Prize
winner and everything. Wonderful writer. And she gives it wonderful acclaim and the back blurb, and she talks about how she brings Connemara alive, and it's a fantastic praise. And you're referring there, of course, to the New York Review of Books reprint of The Island of the Horses and The Lost Island. Wonderful books as well. We'll be talking about those maybe during the course of the book club. So who else now hasn't had a chance to, let me see.
My name is Cecily Lynch, and I'm the leader in Mayfield's book club in Cork. And my job is to scout around and get good books for the people who are in the book club.
Great.
So I just love being here. I'm learning, and I read the 3 chapters and loved them. Just loved them.
Wonderful news, Cecily. It's great to have you here. I do, and I did say earlier, I think it is a neglected book, and it is great to be shining a spotlight on it now. So it's exciting, and the responses so far have been very positive. So thank you for that, Cecily. Is there somebody else now? I'm looking out to see. Have most of us said hello? Monica, how are you, Monica?
I had read some of her books when I was about 15. And I presumed I had read this one. I hadn't, but I've read the first, few chapters.
Yes, very good. So you had a familiarity with her work already.
Yeah.
Great. That's great. So it's lovely to meet you all, and thanks for leaving on the cameras, because it really does help to make it more personal and more intimate as a group. So I suppose the biographical information, you're probably aware of it. You can read it yourselves. But just to make a few points about her Galway connection in particular, she was born in Galway on the 7th of March 1920, and her parents were Thomas Dillon, Professor of Chemistry at NUI Galway, and Geraldine Plunkett, who of course was a sister of 1916 Rising leader Joseph Mary Plunkett. And the family lived in Dangan House. I'll just show you a photo of Dangan House. This photograph is taken from Inside Ireland, her memoir, and a lovely photograph by Tom Kennedy, who illustrated the book with his photographs. And it's interesting now to see Dangan House as it is today. It is, let me see now, stop share, and then so today it's the Dangan House Garden Centre and Tea Room. A beautiful oasis. Always love stopping off there. And the house today is, let me see now, can you see that? So there's a more recent photo of the house. And so when after about 3 years, Thomas Dillon moved the family to Barna, and Eilish went to Barna National School, where she became fluent in Irish, and she later went to the Presentation and ultimately then to the Ursuline Convent in Sligo. She paints a vivid and memorable picture of her time in Dangan, and she says, "The days were wonderful in that beautiful place. A stream with kingfishers ran just beyond the gravel sweep before the door. On windy days, the song of the pines made heavenly music. Distant dogs barked and were answered by ours." And then she says, "Our greatest delight was to cross the river and land at the little stone harbour of Menlo Castle." And she also writes of Galway, "Though I left it as a child, I have used it over and over again throughout my working life." So we'll be talking, as I said, shortly with Cormac and Elaine about their mother and perhaps about her relationship to Galway as well. An immensely versatile writer, Eilís Dillon wrote 50 books, and her career spanned more than 5 decades. Her themes are wide-ranging, from island life on the Atlantic coast to her knowledge of the oral tradition and folklore and history. And she was a pioneer in many ways. She's been translated into 14 languages. And her first books were children's books in Irish and English at a time when there were very few publications for young people in the country. And she also wrote a number of detective novels which depicted the Ireland of her time. She wrote 6 historical novels. She wrote non-fiction books, such as, for example, Inside Ireland was one of them. And she also edited some anthologies and wrote plays. And she was the recipient of many awards and honours. And of course, the Eilís Dillon Book Award every year is named in her honour. So just a very succinct summary of the book. It's concerned with the birth of the new Irish state, and it depicts a society that is clearly in flux. It is spread over 22 relatively short chapters. And the summary at the back of the book gives us a very short overview. A group of young people cut off in Connemara by IRA action are forced to come to terms with life and death. As the plot builds to its inevitable climax, their haunting experiences change their lives and their hopes forever. The cast of characters, as you've ascertained, includes the Macaulay family. We have Pat, the older brother, Ruth, Nora and Brian. Ruth's fiance is Coleman Andrews. Sarah Lynch is the local lady minding the twin babies Paul and Jane. Then Kate Faherty, the local woman who is their cook at Derrylee House. And then there's a host of other colourful characters, local characters such as Hannah Frank, etc. And we'll be talking about those over the next few weeks. So I think we'll start now with our general reactions to the book and so far. And because we're a large group, I think we'll break into smaller rooms to have a chat for about 12 to 15 minutes. And I have 3 questions to ask you. So they're quite simple. How are you experiencing the book so far? Were you engaged by it immediately, or is it taking a while to get into it? What passages strike you as especially enjoyable or insightful or compelling? And thirdly, how would you describe the 2 characters at the heart of the novel, Ruth Macaulay and Coleman Andrews? And what are some of the challenges of their relationship so far? If you want to make a note of that, of those 3 questions, do so by all means. And I will, when I stop sharing now in a minute, you're going to automatically go into 4 small rooms. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Can everyone hear me again there? Great. Well, it sounds like everyone was having, lively and engaged conversations, which was lovely to hear, and also the range of topics of interest, and a lot of people focusing in on the atmosphere which she's building, the world she's creating, and the tension that's mounting. And a bit of speculation going on about the location of the cafe, the tea room, and where it might be situated, and then about the sibling relationship between Pat and Ruth, looking out for his sisters, and so lots of engagement already, which is great to see. Would any of you like to ask questions arising out of that, or want to make a point that we can come back to maybe next week, or? No? Okay, so I'm going to come on now to our 2 special guests this evening. Born in Cork, Emily Cullen is an emeritus professor, an emeritus fellow of Trinity College Dublin, and was Ireland Professor of Poetry between 2016 and 2019. She has published academic work on the Renaissance, on translation, and on Irish writing. Originally with MacDara Woods, Pierce Hutchinson and Leland Bardwell, she has edited since 1975 the Irish poetry journal Ciphers. She has published 9 collections of poetry over 47 years, most recently The Mother House from Galway Press in Ireland and Wake Forest Press in North Carolina. And of course, The Mother House received the Irish Times Poetry Now Award 2020. Yay! Congratulations, Elaine. Her collected poems will appear this year, and we're all waiting with bated breath for the collected poems. Cormac O'Quillan is the youngest child of Eilís Dillon and former chairman of the Irish Writers' Centre and of the Irish Translators and Interpreters Association. He taught Italian at Trinity College Dublin for more than 30 years, and he has written 2 crime novels as Cormac Miller. And these are An Irish Solution, 2004, and The Grounds, 2006, both published by Penguin, and plenty of accolades for those 2, indeed. And so just to say, it's an honour to have you both here. Fáilte is fiche. So lovely to have people of directly connected to Eilís herself. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm going to ask a few little questions now. I suppose one thing that strikes me is that there's a deep ancestral memory embedded in the DNA of your mother's work. And of course, it's no wonder, given the distinguished heritage of the Dillon Plunkett family. And I love the first line of Inside Ireland, your mum's memoir, where she says, "When my parents first became interested in each other, about 1912, they had no idea that Plunketts and Dillons had been intermarrying for more than 500 years." So first thing I'd like to ask you both is, could you tell us a bit about that sense of ancestry? Did you grow up hearing your mum talk about your unique family heritage and all those branches of the family, going back to Oliver Plunkett and John Blake Dillon and such a distinguished lineage? Cormac, would you like to start there? Can you please unmute there? Thank you.
I'd like to hand over to my sister on this topic.
Okay.
To Elaine,
Yeah.
if you don't mind.
Yeah, perfect.
Yes, we heard a fair amount, especially about the Plunketts. And I've been thinking about this today because I knew you were going to ask that question. And it has just struck me that what we were hearing was, to some extent, a sort of counter-narrative, because the person that told the first story was my grandmother, Mamo Geraldine Plunkett, and she had a sense of the family and especially of the recent generations of the family. And a lot of it was to do with what went wrong, what was wrong with her mother especially. And I think to some extent, Eilís was pushing back against this and thinking, another story that could be told. And at various points, for example, in Inside Ireland, but also in other places, she goes back to that further ancestry, which she, I think, found particularly interesting. Oliver Plunkett comes into the story because of something that happened in 1921. He was beatified, and her grandfather went to Rome. So did Sean T. O'Kelly, who was Minister for Foreign Affairs in the First Dáil, and they opened an embassy, and to the fury of the British in Rome, actually had a political presence there. So Oliver Plunkett came out of retirement, so to speak, and became an actor in the War of Independence, especially in that constitutional effort to assert the role of Dáil Éireann as a legitimate government. And I think that's where he fitted in, so to speak. So we heard lots about Oliver Plunkett, not the grisliest bits. We were always, and not just in our own family, there was this identification.
Yes, that's a fascinating story, Elaine. I would love to see an essay from you. Can we prompt you to put this down into another lovely prose piece for us? That's fascinating that Oliver was revitalised as part of the the ideological battles that were. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I mean, I think you, as a poet and seer and visionary, you have a kind of a whole composite of all of those voices, those ancestral voices, and that history and that tradition and that oral tradition in your work. And yeah, I mean, that just became apparent to me recently, I suppose, when looking through your work again and thinking about your mum and your heritage. And I just want to acknowledge that and say that I think it's wonderful, and yeah, that you're kind of like a channel for all of this history and this rich heritage. So I suppose another question then I'd like to ask is just some memories about your mum as a woman and as a person. And last week, Cormac, you mentioned about how methodical she was about her writing processes. Could you expand a little bit on that, maybe?
I could. I mean, writing books, as we know, takes an appalling amount of time, and it needs a continuity of attention, which is not so easy in the modern world, and I think probably it never has been. Now, combine that with her other responsibilities. I mean, she had a few different lives going on. She was the respectable wife of a professor in the university in Cork, and she was active in cultural life in Cork with the Dante Society, which she helped to found, in the musical life, all kinds of things. And she was running a hostel, did I mention that, with 39 students in it and a staff of 3 or 4.
6.
And 6, okay, right. So Elaine once had to step in to...
Was that the Honan Hostel? Sorry, Cormac. Was that you have
the Honan Hostel, yes.
And this
gorgeous collection, The Vibrant House, Irish Writing and Domestic Space. There's a beautiful essay by Elaine in this, and you talk about the Honan Hostel, and yeah. So sorry, keep going there, Cormac.
Yeah.
I mean, this was just one of her little activities. Now, the house we lived in had 17 rooms and was on the large side, because the first warden of the hostel had been told to build himself a house, and he hadn't stopped doing so for some time. So it was very large. Now, she did have a full-time housekeeper, plus another woman who came in half-time to keep the place clean. And when I was a baby, there was also a children's nurse. So a staff of thousands, as you might say, relative to today.
And yet she took pride in not raising her head when the doorbell rang. When she was writing between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. I thought that was a lovely anecdote. Did you see a lot of her papers everywhere when she was writing? And
yes, but not particularly much, because she tidied things away. Also, when I was out at school, I thought she wasn't doing anything much when I was away, because she was always ready for me when I came home. I hadn't realized that just how much time she was spending, but it really was very concentrated time. She believed that if you sit in the right place every day, inspiration will strike, and it did. So that was part of her method. I mean, she wrote longhand and then corrected and then typed it up, or had somebody else type it up later on in life. Her first books written directly on a typewriter was in Rome, the Across the Bitter Sea, done on an Olivetti electric typewriter. And then afterwards she was into computers, but in a very odd way. She believed you had to switch them off if you wanted to open a new document. There was some confusion in her use of the computer, but she really had the ability to work very fast and very concentratedly. So that was, while giving the impression that all of these things happened fairly naturally, she didn't get into a flap, but she worked very hard, if I could put it that way.
I mean, it is remarkable that just her versatility, that she could oscillate or modulate from crime fiction to historical fiction to children's books, and the range is fantastic altogether. And then I'm even more impressed that she could transition from, minding her children back from school to writing novels, and it's wonderful.
Voracious reader. I mean, she's one of the best read persons I've ever met. So, I mean, apart from as well as the Irish Press and the Irish Times, the Times Literary Supplement was in the house. We were aware, I was aware, scandalously young, of the work of Dylan Thomas and the lore and language of school children. She let children look into books that perhaps not everybody would at the time, while at the same time maintaining, I think, a pretty good facade as a reasonably respectable lady of Cork.
Okay.
I don't think the really respectable ladies of Cork would have agreed with you, but because one of the things they said to her was, books aren't drawing room furniture.
Interesting. And you have written, Elaine, that in a locked cupboard in that room, in the drawing room, was her collection of books banned by the censorship board, to which I later was to be gradually introduced.
That's a lovely image of your mother.
Yes.
Introducing the censored books.
Yeah, it was the same cupboard as she kept the drink in. And one of the things she was good at was when a book came out that everybody knew was going to be banned, there was a short period during which you could skip out and get hold of it and then you would have it. And of course, this was a skill that people developed in the 40s and 50s, and probably earlier, because you needed to do that if you want. There were lots and lots of books that you couldn't read, not just by Irish authors, and of course not just particularly sexy books.
Yes.
But also books by Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene and people like that.
Yeah.
You had to be quick off the mark if you were going to.
The mark to get in before the censorship board. That's fascinating. And I'd love to read more about that too. I know Julia Carlson's book Banned in Ireland talks, is very helpful on the subject, but what you're saying about the skill of getting in there is also another lovely insight. As a renowned author yourself, Elaine, how profound would you say your mum's influence has been on your career and your decision to become a poet?
Well, I became a poet because there was already a novelist in the house. It was a sort of division of labour. She thought poetry was a very good thing to write because it would prepare you for writing prose properly. And I think she was a little surprised when I didn't make the transition. But I had also, of course, worked out that novels are hard to do if you have another job, though not impossible. I think for all of her children, she was convinced that they had talents that they should develop and would want that they'd all it needed was a good deal of hard work. My sister was actually did have a very big musical talent, and she was very much supported by my mother in developing that. So that was all. It was her conviction that we could do it if we only tried. That was quite important.
And another lovely line that really, just the image stayed with me. You said, "My mother rode out on her bicycle, dangling her cello." I love that, dangling her cello with her bicycle. So music was very important to her, obviously.
I think it had been very important to her, especially when she was growing up. Being at boarding school, she played the cello. She practiced. She got lessons, and I sometimes think that she realized that she wasn't as good as she might have been, but she wanted have a go at it. Cork had a very bright musical culture at the time with Alois Fleischmann, and he always needed cello players. When his first daughter was born, he said, "She'll play the cello," and sure enough, she did. So the cello playing was part of her way into a local society.
Okay, but she was still part of an orchestra, and no doubt very, 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 very accomplished on the cello, no doubt.
Towards the end of her life, she was in Santa Barbara, California, and she found an old Viennese cellist who was giving lessons there. And I have to report that she got much better in her 60s than she had been in her 30s. So there you are.
So there's hope for us all.
Hope for us all. Yes.
Lovely vindication
of lifelong learning. Thank you, Cormac. That's lovely. Just two more questions, and we might then wrap up. There's a very strong sense that her writing is so vibrant, and the descriptive detail about the land and the landscape of Connemara is just so powerful and so vivid. Do you think, even though she spent her life living in cities and urban centres, do you think that her heart might have been in Galway to an extent? There's, a lot of people comment that it really comes alive, and when she's writing about the Connemara landscape and the islands, and
I think the Connemara landscape was what really appealed to her. It was from just a particular period in her own childhood, and that was, I think, at the centre of her feeling. But of course, Galway was the very, very familiar place where she knew people and people knew her.
Yes, yeah.
She had a great sense of place. I mean, she also wrote things set in Rome and in Spain, and in Dublin. Not so much in Cork. I remember going to Connemara for the first time with my parents, and thinking, well, I've now arrived in the real Ireland, and then looking around to see what was real about it that wasn't real about Cork. As a patriotic Cork man, you know, I think Cork is perfectly all right. But one of the comments on her first detective story, Death at Crane's Court, says it's so lovely and so peaceful, you would want to pack your bags and leave for Connemara at once, and presumably get murdered when you get there, because it's a detective story. But she had that sense of places and institutions. One reviewer said about another of her detective stories, at last somebody who could really run a big house properly, you know, that all of the things were in their places. That's very much part of her appreciation of surroundings. I should say, just so in case I don't say it again, that the whole of the Bitter Glass is on Kindle, and is available obviously from Amazon on Kindle for those who can't get a paper copy at the moment.
Thank you for saying that. That's important to say, Cormac. And your own crime fiction, did your mum's crime writing inspire you, Cormac, to make those forays into crime writing yourself, do you think?
In a way, yes. But it was very much the crime fiction of the time, which is, it has a closed ending. You eventually arrive at a conclusion, whereas the more modern, subsequent to that, the sort of Raymond Chandler inspired writing is more open-ended and rolling in its structure. However, I did borrow her university that she set up in the Phoenix Park as the location for my second published detective story, which is about a very decadent and badly run university. As I worked in Trinity, I used to find people coming up and shaking my hands with great emotion, which I think they thought I must have been writing about Trinity.
Oh, oh, that's funny. That's funny. Well, that is fascinating. I suppose I'm conscious of the time now, but I can't resist asking a final question to Elaine there. As a woman writer, and I suppose as a poet myself and a scholar, I'm, very interested in feminist writing. And your mother, of course, managed to escape the censorship board and managed to write to create these wonderful women who had agency and some feisty characters, and yet did it all quite tastefully, a skill in itself. And I'm just, I suppose, thinking about the subsequent debates. The Irish Women's Liberation Movement didn't happen until 1970, and The Bitter Glass came out in 1958. And early on in the book, your mother invokes Mother Era. And of course, she was writing at a time of, a conservative society. And the debates about the gendering of Ireland as feminine didn't really happen until the 70s onwards. So I'm just wondering what you think she would have felt about the gender nation debates, and things like the Field Day anthology, about the marginalisation of Irish women writers. Did she ever talk about that?
I think it wasn't such a bad period for women writers in terms just of productivity, because you have people like Mary Lavin, Kate O'Brien. Early on, you had somebody like Elizabeth Bowen. There were women writers of fiction.
Sorry, just to signal, we've 1 minute left, so I'll leave the last word to yourself, Elaine. Bye, everyone. See you next week.
Yeah, there were women writers of fiction. I think Mother Era is used in that in a slightly ironic tone there. But I think we also have to remember that the gendering in a lot of the discussion, I think, rather simplifies the gender issue. One of the people that she admired most from the past was Eileen Dovney-Hunnell, who is not only a wonderful poet, but somebody who describes herself as an extraordinarily energetic and positive person. And I think she had plenty of, even her
role models.
She had plenty of examples of active feminine people within the Irish tradition.
And that's a lovely note to end our first session on. Thank you very much to Cormac and Elaine, and to you all, and see you next week. Happy reading. Bye.